Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello, welcome back to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz the Chadillo.
The US government is up and running again, and so are we. Our guest this week is the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci.
One thing I would suggest to the president, not that he would listen to me, is just dial back some of the nonsense on Twitter.
The Democrats have won a House, but I've got a wall, and they'll be on the agenda.
In the History Department this week, the first woman to run for a major party's presidential nomination, Shirley Chisholm.
People are interested in having candidates that are truthful, candidates that have, if you will, just a tiny bit of morality.
And Roger Stone becomes the first Planet America guest to be indicted by Robert Mueller. We could not be prouder.
Punch.
Let's get newsy.
First this week to the end of the 35-day US government shutdown, the longest in American history. Around 800,000 federal workers were finally back on the job this week after being furloughed or forced to work without pay. The shutdown was triggered on December 22nd when the president demanded an appropriations bill include $5.7 billion in funding for his promised border wall. Democrats refused to allow any bill with wall funding through Congress. In the end, the president blinked, signing a 3-week continuing resolution without wall funding to reopen government agencies. And he has now signalled he is prepared to go around Congress and use emergency funding to pay for the wall.
As everyone knows, I have a very powerful alternative, but I didn't want to use it at this time.
But this time could be as soon as February 15, when the short-term deal expires. And polls suggest the president has little to gain from a second shutdown. President Trump's average approval rating slipped 1.5 points during the shutdown, but his disapproval rating jumped almost 4 points up. The Congressional Budget Office, meanwhile, estimates this shutdown has cost the US economy at least $11 billion. That is around twice the cost of that border wall, Chaz.
Yeah, although the CBO has also predicted that the government will now catch up some of that lost economic activity. Yeah, only about $3 billion. Only $3 billion of those losses are projected to be permanent. Many of the furloughed federal workers will also be paid back pay. No word, though, on the hundreds of thousands of federal contractors who are not scheduled to be paid. Given that 78% of workers in a recent study said they lived paycheck to paycheck, that is a lot of potential damage out there. As far as shutdown politics goes, well, as John said, this has not been great for Trump. The public actually blamed congressional Republicans 3 points less for the shutdown as it wore on. They blamed Democrats 2 points more, and they blamed Trump 5 points more as the shutdown wore on. So that was not great for him. John mentioned Trump's approval dropping slightly. Well, Nancy Pelosi's numbers actually went up during the shutdown. Pelosi's approval amongst Democrats went from 63 to 73%. That's a 10-point jump in 2 weeks. But Trump's biggest problem was this. The shutdown was supposed to be about elevating the importance of border security. And Trump succeeded in convincing 59% of people that border security was an emergency. But 75% of people thought the shutdown was the emergency, so it was backfiring, which was why he had to pull the plug. But where to now? A congressional committee is currently trying to find a compromise. For an insight as to how those conversations are going, a Republican aide said they're discussing the grey area of border security, where technology and steel fences can be called different things by each party as they try to save face. Great, so it's 100% about branding then. And of course there's this hanging over the negotiations.
In 21 days, if there's no deal, it's off to the races.
In this case, I think the races refers to Trump declaring a state of emergency and getting the military to build the wall, just ignoring Congress altogether. But of course, If he did do that, the Democrats would take him to court immediately. They'd say it wasn't a real emergency, and there'd be every chance the battle would go for years with no wall to show for it. Also, only 24% of people say Trump should declare a state of emergency. 53% of people say he should neither declare a state of emergency nor shut down the government. But importantly, 47% of Republicans say he should declare a state of emergency. And Republicans have a way of getting Trump's attention, John. This was Ann Coulter after Trump reopened the government last week. Good news for George H.W. Bush. As of today, he's no longer the biggest wimp ever to serve as president. Ouch. They are tough markers, John.
Yeah, certainly are. And Ann Coulter had a role in Trump shutting down the government in the first place when she got on his back last time. Interesting influence. Political operative Roger Stone appeared in court this week following his indictment by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Stone was arrested last weekend in a dramatic pre-dawn raid by armed FBI officers at his home in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
It's unconscionable. I would have been more than happy. They knew I was represented. Had they contacted my attorneys, I would have voluntarily turned myself in. I would have been able to wear a suit and tie for my mugshot. It would have looked a lot better.
Stone pleaded not guilty when he appeared in court in Washington, D.C. this week, charged with lying to a congressional investigation into his alleged role in the release of hacked emails by WikiLeaks during the 2016 campaign. The 66-year-old, who has worked with Donald Trump since the early 1980s and was an early campaign advisor, is also charged with obstruction and witness tampering. But perhaps the most tantalising clue to come from Stone's indictment was this. A senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone after the release of the hacked DNC emails to find out what other damaging information Organisation 1, or WikiLeaks, had regarding the Clinton campaign. Who was in a position to order a senior Trump campaign official? An even more senior Trump campaign official, maybe even Trump himself. On that, we do not yet know. Meanwhile, Acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker announced this week that he thinks that Robert Mueller's investigation is almost at an end.
But right now, the investigation is, I think, close to being completed, and I hope that we can get the report from Director Mueller as soon as possible.
Who knows what's going on there? Well, actually, I'll tell you, someone who does know what's going to happen with the Mueller investigation,
Really?
Roger Stone.
I honestly believe that they are going to try to charge the president and the vice president with some hoked up frame of Russian collusion. That way they could make Nancy Pelosi president, she could make Hillary Clinton vice president, and then step aside. It's a nightmare.
Yep. Even after being indicted for false testimony, Roger still isn't quite done spinning crap. I've long been sceptical that Mueller would dig up a solid conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia, but I've got to say, this indictment is interesting. There was one email in particular from Person 1, who was Stone's supposed go-between with WikiLeaks, Jerome Corsi. Anyway, he told Stone it wouldn't hurt to start suggesting that Hillary is old, has a bad memory, has had a stroke, that neither Bill nor Hillary is well. I expect that to be much of the focus of the next email dump. Then, 2 days after Corsi's email, Stone's InfoWars associate PJ Watson released a video accusing Clinton of having a host of ailments, including brain damage. Now, for his part, Watson denies that Stone told him anything. He says he made his video because of a number of incidents that occurred in the previous few months, like Hillary having coughing fits. Nevertheless, that prompted a right-wing feeding frenzy about Hillary's health, which Trump himself participated in, and a few weeks later, WikiLeaks promoted a few newly released leaks based around Hillary having decision fatigue and needing wake-up pills. Now, this could all just be a coincidence. Maybe Stone never told this stuff to the Trump campaign. Maybe Corsi was just guessing what WikiLeaks would do. After all, Hillary's health had been speculated about independently before. And even if WikiLeaks was coordinating with the Trump campaign, asking WikiLeaks for tip-offs about upcoming releases and then acting on that information is not necessarily against the law. But regardless, I think it's worth acknowledging that this indictment is at least getting closer to making a Russia connection than we've seen in the past. But last word, John, has got to go to Randy Credico.
Does it gotta?
Yeah, it's got to.
Okay.
He's the witness that Roger Stone allegedly tried to intimidate.
Threatened to kill his dog?
I know. This is what Credico told Stone. You should have just been honest with the House Intel Committee. You've opened yourself up to perjury charges like an idiot. Indeed.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
Well, most of us were taking a break. The 2020 US presidential campaign was getting underway, one of the earliest starts in history, and it's already the most diverse field of candidates ever. Among the Democratic contenders often running, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, and Senator Kamala Harris of California. Also declaring their candidacies, former Housing Secretary Julian Castro of Texas, Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, and the Mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, who is seeking to become the first ever openly gay president. Former Maryland Congressman John Delaney has been running for a year without making much of an impact. Similarly unnoticed, entrepreneur Andrew Yang is also technically running, and we've had our first dropout. Former West Virginia State Senator Richard Ojeda, a Democrat who supported Donald Trump in 2016, has now ended his own White House bid because...
I don't want to see people, send money to a campaign that's probably not going to get off the ground.
And we're still waiting to hear from a long list of likely Democratic candidates. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, former Vice President Joe Biden, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Washington Governor Jay Inslee, as well as former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, all still weighing their decisions. Meanwhile, billionaire former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg is still openly talking about running as a Democrat and hanging around in New Hampshire, while former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz, a longtime Democratic mega donor, had this surprise announcement last weekend.
I am seriously thinking of running for president.
You and everyone else in America, Howard, but then there was this twist.
I will run as a centrist independent.
That immediately raised fears that he would split the Democratic vote and only help to re-elect Donald Trump, who quickly took to Twitter to goad his fellow billionaire.
Howard Schultz doesn't have the guts to run for president.
Meanwhile, this was the piece of free advice that Schultz was given at a book signing event in New York earlier this week.
Don't help elect Trump, you egotistical billionaire.
And another Democrat who had been preparing to run for president, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, announced this week he will not be a candidate in 2020.
Back to that tweet taunting Howard Schultz, though, John. Trump didn't even try to hide what that was about. Apparently, Trump told a fundraiser he was trying to get Howard Schultz into the race because he thinks Schultz's candidacy will help him out. And he's probably right. The Washington Post put out a poll this week where 56% of people said that they would definitely not vote for Trump in 2020, giving Trump a ceiling of 44%. And that included 59% of independents, 64% of women, and 56% of suburbanites, all saying they would definitely not vote for Trump. Now, I know this is still early days for 2020 and he's coming off the shutdown, but during Obama's first term, the maximum number of people who said they'd definitely not vote for Obama was 46%. And the number of people who voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 was 47%. So that might be a poll worth paying attention to. Obviously, it'll be a problem if Trump's vote is limited to 44%, unless you get someone like Howard Schultz in, who siphons votes from both parties, and then a vote in the high 30s or low 40s might be a winning result. Hence, Trump's reverse psychology. Schultz running might be his best chance of re-election. Of course, Democrats all know this as well, which is why they are currently hating all over Howard Schultz on Twitter. But I am not going to do that.
Really?
Yes. I'm just going to tell Howard why he is completely wasting his time. To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
Welcome to our new, bigger wall. It is so big that we can finally fit Bert Newton's face in it. Almost. Anyway, Howard Schultz's team thinks that he should run as an independent because Gallup's latest polling shows that 39% of people see themselves as independents, compared to 34% who see themselves as Democrats and 25% who see themselves as Republicans. And that is all true. But it's also misleading, which polling guru Nate Silver put a little less diplomatically. But this is why. These are the party identification figures for the last 25 years or so. Right across the board, lots of independents. But this is what happened when Gallup asked those independents if they were leaning towards a particular party. All of a sudden, they didn't seem so independent. They're all up here. Generally speaking, pure independents only make up about 10% of the population. Now, you might say, go back to the other graph, please, thank you. You might say, if someone calls themselves an independent, they must at least have an open mind. No, not anymore, because over the last 25 years or so, we've all grown to hate each other very much, and independents are no exception. These are the independents who have a very unfavourable view of the Republican Party, and these are the independents who have a very unfavourable view of the Democratic Party. By 2016, they're about 30% of both. That's 60% of supposed independents who hate one of the parties. And the consequence of all this? Pure independents were even more stable in their party support between 2000 and 2004 than strong partisans were between 1972 and 1976. That's right. Independents are now more partisan these days than strong partisans used to be. So in other words, there is no pot of independents waiting to be won over by you, Howard Schultz. They're just Republicans and Democrats in disguise. Oh, and by the way, no, not yet. Schultz's ideas are a problem as well. Like many businessmen, he's concerned about debt and fiscal responsibility. He's an economic conservative, but he's also big on diversity, immigration, and he's pro-gay marriage. In other words, he's a social liberal. Now, Schultz thinks that this mishmash puts him in the popular middle ground, but he's wrong. This is a map of the ideologies of 2016 voters, okay? Red dots, Trump voters, blue dots, Clinton voters. Now, these are the social liberals, these are social conservatives, these are the economic liberals, these are the economic conservatives. So, socially liberal and economically liberal, that's where the Democrats are. Socially conservative and economically conservative, that's where the Republicans are. Socially conservative and economically liberal, that's where a lot of Trump's populist supporters are. But socially liberal and economically conservative, well, that's where Howard Schultz is, by himself, with nobody to vote for him. I know that well, Howard, because I'm there as well. And neither you nor I are ever going to be president. Sorry!
Big, beautiful world.
More now on this week's official presidential campaign launch by Senator Kamala Harris in her hometown of Oakland, California.
We are here because the American dream and our American democracy are under attack and on the line like never before. I stand before you today to announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
And here's what you should know about Kamala Harris. First of all, it's Kamala, as in relaxed, not Kamala. She's a Democratic senator from the state of California. She is 54 years old. She was elected in 2016. Before that, she was state attorney general for 6 years and a district attorney in San Francisco for 7 years before that. And having been a DA and an AG means she was responsible for a lot of things, including criminal prosecutions, and we can expect that, Chaz, to be closely examined by her rivals.
Oh yeah, it's already drawn some attention. the major issues seem to be that she refused to support statewide standards for police wearing body cameras. She didn't support the proposed reform of the 3 strikes law in California.
Said that wasn't her business, it's up to the legislators.
Yeah, and she defended the death penalty when a judge ruled it to be unconstitutional. Now, she has explanations for all 3 of those, but the thing that really gets Liberals was that she fought to uphold wrongful convictions that had been secured through police misconduct, including evidence tampering, false testimony and the suppression of crucial information by prosecutors. Anyway, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about that, because as you say, her opponents definitely will be.
Yes, well, Kamala Harris hit the ground running with a town hall style forum in First to Vote Iowa this week. Broadcast by CNN, and straight off the bat she signed up to the new, though vague, orthodoxy of the progressive side of the Democratic Party, Medicare for all.
The idea is that everyone gets access to medical care, and you don't have to go through the process of going through an insurance company, having them give you approval, going through the paperwork, all of the delay that may require. Let's eliminate all of that. Let's move on.
Well, of course, currently Medicare is just for the over 65s in America, and while the idea of universal health care is becoming a lot more popular in the wake of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, the idea of abolishing private insurance altogether is creating a bit of a stir.
Absolutely, especially amongst Republicans, because they smell blood. You might recall the big fuss that was made when Obama said that under Obamacare, if you like your healthcare plan, you could keep your healthcare plan.
Not so much.
Yeah, it turned out to not be true. Wow. That affected a few million fairly ordinary healthcare plans.
Not good ones, yeah.
No, but now we are talking about 177 million healthcare plans, many of which people like very much. According to Gallup, 69% of people rate their healthcare plans as excellent or good. So telling those people, well, we're going to take those plans from you, whether you like it or not, might not be so popular. And here's the proof. If you ask people if they support Medicare for all, you get 56% support to 42% opposition. Very popular. But if you then ask them if they support a Medicare for all program that eliminates private health insurance companies, you suddenly get 37% support to 58% opposition. Very unpopular, and that is before a single attack ad has been made. I don't know if Kamala Harris understood the full implications of what she was saying then, but that grab could haunt her till next November. I suspect she knows now though, because the very next day, one of her spokespeople quietly said that Harris would also be open to the more moderate health reform plans, which would preserve the insurance industry.
Watch out. Well, when Kamala Harris announced her presidential bid this week, she paid an interesting tribute to the first black woman to run for America's highest office for a major party. Her name, Shirley Chisholm. Senator Harris's staff revealed that both the font and the colour of their campaign logo, as well as the slogan for the people, were inspired by Chisholm, who ran for the presidency almost half a century ago. Diminutive, bespectacled, almost obscured by the microphones, New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm stepped up to the podium in a Brooklyn church to announce her candidacy for President of the United States in late January 1972, aware of the history of the moment, but also asking voters to look beyond it.
I am convinced that the American people are in a mood to discard the politics and the political personalities of the past. I believe that they will show in 1972 and thereafter that they intend to make independent judgments on the merits of a particular candidate.
Before her 2 terms in Congress, Chisholm had been a state legislator, political activist and educator.
We cannot continue to take things as they are.
Reporters wanted to know why she was running. Was she qualified?
The United States Constitution stipulates that anyone that is 35 years of age or over and is a natural-born citizen can run for the presidency. All of us meet that criteria. The people will make a decision.
And that was the point. She was running because she had the right to. Like every woman, like every black person, just none of them had done it before.
People are interested in having candidates that are truthful, candidates that have, if you will, just a tiny bit of morality.
But Chisholm's campaign started late. She skipped the early primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire, which saw frontrunner Ed Muskie stumble, and the unexpected rise of progressive anti-war Senator George McGovern. Chisholm tried, though, to tap into that anti-establishment mood.
I think it's quite well known that I don't enter most things with the blessings of any party. I think it's quite well known. Anybody who's followed my political career knows very, very keenly that I am the only unbought and unbossed politician. That's why I am running.
Shirley Chisholm's campaign struggled to raise money and even get on primary ballots. When she did, the Congresswoman typically only attracted single-digit support, but she resisted repeated calls to drop out.
A Catholic for Change has to be able to withstand the insults, the humiliations, the abuses, and the slurs. What's wrong with my running for president of this country?
Chisholm knew she wasn't going to be the next president of the United States. For her, campaigning for the presidency was a way of promoting issues like education, equal rights for women, racial equality, child and healthcare. And she received the support of prominent members of the feminist movement like Gloria Steinem.
Shirley Chisholm has not got the depth and breadth of the coverage she deserves. But the fact is that with or without that coverage, she represents a coalition of the powerless.
Raise your fist! But Chisholm couldn't win the support of the male-dominated civil rights movement or the male-dominated Democratic Party.
The black politicians are no different from the white politicians. They've made their deals, they've made their contracts.
The field of Democratic candidates running to unseat President Richard Nixon in 1972 included race-baiting Alabama Governor George Wallace, a longtime segregationist. When Wallace was shot and nearly killed after a campaign speech in Maryland, Shirley Chisholm surprised and dismayed some of her supporters by visiting him in hospital as he lay critically wounded.
And he held on to my hand so tightly, he didn't want me to go.
George Wallace survived, though confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He was a changed man and later apologised for the pain he had caused black people, and he asked for their forgiveness.
I'm sorry that I did that because it gave the wrong opinion of the kind of man that I was.
Shirley Chisholm continued her presidential campaign until George McGovern's nomination was formalised.
I am not downhearted, I'm not disillusioned, I am not bitter.
She was voted one of the 10 most admired women in America in 1976 and continued to work in Congress until the early 1980s. She died in 2005, not living to see America's first black president, but many credit her with helping to pave the way.
The only thing I continue to regret, of course, is that we didn't have the moolah.
There was a remarkable public disagreement between top US intelligence officials and President Trump this week. This is the kind of thing that President Trump has been saying ever since his summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un last June.
We agreed to the denuclearization of North Korea.
But here's Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates this week in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
We currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival.
Well, while the Intelligence Committee doesn't think that North Korea is going to give up its nukes, it does think that Iran is technically abiding by the terms of the agreement, halting its nuclear program.
The intelligence people seem to be extremely passive and naive when it comes to the dangers of Iran. They are wrong.
So, a bit of daylight there between the President and his own intelligence chiefs, with the President maintaining he knows better, although he also says it's the media's fault.
Look, of course, there's no reason that the President should necessarily agree with his intelligence people. They're supposed to provide him with information, and he's supposed to be the one providing the judgment and the conclusions. And let's face it, part of the reason he was elected was because he's a disruptor of Washington consensus. But it is funny when he tweets that his intelligence people should go back to school right after he misuses the word there. Look, it's a cheap shot, I know, but come on! Look, there is one more disagreement you can add to that list, though, John. There's speculation that America may have struck a deal with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan over the next 18 months, despite the Pentagon wanting to stay longer. We'll no doubt be hearing more about that soon, but some are wondering about how desirable this deal could possibly be when the Afghan government now only controls 55% of the country. The Taliban are negotiating for a position of strength. Anyway, I put a good article about this on our Facebook page. Read about it there if you are interested.
Well, it seems like a million years ago. In fact, it's just about 18 months since Anthony Scaramucci was controversially appointed White House Communications Director. Immediately, President Trump's official spokesman, Sean Spicer, resigned in protest.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders is going to be the press secretary. And so you can congratulate her after the session. You still can't hear me? No sound? Okay.
Inauspicious start. Then came this bombshell.
Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci unleashing a profane attack against Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, telling a reporter from The New Yorker Reince is a expletive paranoid schizophrenic.
And then
Reince Priebus is out as White House Chief of Staff tonight after just 6 months on the job.
And then
after a mere 10 days on the job, Anthony Scaramucci is out as White House Communications Director.
Well, despite his sacking, Anthony Scaramucci has remained a strong supporter of President Trump. But what does he make of the continued controversies and legal problems swirling around his old boss? Let's find out. Anthony Scaramucci is with us from New York. Welcome to Planet America.
It's great to be here, John. Thank you for including me.
Roger Stone, of course, has been indicted for lying to Congress about his contacts with WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign over the release of those so-called Podesta emails hacked by Russia. Are you concerned about what was going on there and how damaging this could be to President Trump?
Well, I think it's already been damaging. I mean, let's just call it for what it is. To have a 24-month or 22-month investigation, it has been a sideshow that's very distracting to the overall presidency, and I think it's weakened some areas of his ability to get things done. But I think if you're asking the specific question, is it going to remove him from office? I think it actually will not, because even if they find very damning evidence there, unless you can get about 20 Republican senators to flip on him, I don't see him being able to be pushed out of office. So it's troublesome in the country now. We are criminalizing everything that's political. Now we could go back to those WikiLeaks things and we could have an argument over whether they are borderline criminal or not. I'll leave that up to the Justice Department and attorneys that are a lot smarter than me. But here's what I would say. If Secretary Clinton were in office right now, she would be being investigated over the Clinton Foundation and her emails and assorted things like that, which would be putting pressure on her administration. So I would sort of say this in a bipartisan way. We really need to dial back some of the nonsense and the mudslinging that our politicians are throwing at each other and start governing and doing more for the American people. This 35-day shutdown, as an example, is just a ridiculous show of ego. It didn't solve anything. In fact, anything, it hurt the economy.
Why is it that so many associates of this president, top campaign figures like Stone, Manafort, Cohen, Flynn and others, are lying to officials about the election? They're getting caught as well. Why the cover-up?
Well, I think it's an unfortunate thing, but I think that unfortunately is, that is probably the first move strategically. People fear that they may be in more trouble than they actually are, and they have a tendency to lie. And so, I went to law school. Obviously, I know a lot about criminal procedure. Those are felonies. I mean, those are chargeable felonies that put you in jail for a very long time. And as you know, in Australia, like in the United Kingdom and Canada, that under oath is taken very seriously by those four great nations because it's the major anchor tenant of the entire legal system. So, if you go to law school, first thing you learn is you're going to be in way less trouble telling the truth under oath. In our society now, with social media and the way the society has exposed itself in terms of everybody knowing everything about each other, I think it's a real big mistake, real bad tactical mistake to lie to the Congress or lie to federal prosecutors.
The president says that he kept doing business through 2016 because he thought there was a good chance that he would lose. Both Cohen and Giuliani say that included negotiating Trump Tower in Moscow. Is that going to be the issue, do you think, that gets the president into the most serious legal trouble?
You know, I think it's less about that, honestly, and more about past practices inside the organization. I know the New York Times did a whole survey of the transfer of capital from his dad to him and things like that. And so I think the worry would be more related to past business practices and less about the Moscow Tower, so to speak. At the end of the day, the president was probably, as a candidate, hedging his bets. You may know this about our law. There's only one person that is totally exculpated from the emoluments clause, and that's the President of the United States. That dates back to George Washington. In order to encourage him to become the first president, they allowed him to keep his Mount Vernon farm together. And so he's the only person in the government that's excluded from it. When I was asked to join the government, I had to put my company up for sale. And the good news is that I was blown out of the government so quickly that I didn't have to sell the company. I was able to get it back. But the president doesn't have that need or that compulsion from an ethics or regulatory point of view. So you could make the case right now, as upsetting as this would be to your viewers and many American voters, that the president could be operating out of Trump Tower and he could be building international buildings around the world. Now, he would be getting sued and slowed down in the courts, but the legal precedent is on his side that he's the one person in the government that's exculpated from that clause.
We heard in that anonymous New York Times op-ed last year, and from accounts in books including Bob Woodward's, that top Trump White House staff have been working to try and curb his worst instincts and his worst decisions, what they described as an administrative coup. Is that, do you think, what is really going on?
Well, it was obvious that was happening. I said as much to Jake Tapper on a Sunday morning show. I said there are people here. When I was in the White House, I did a few of the Sunday morning shows, and I said to the CNN anchor that there are people inside the White House that think it's their job to protect the United States from the president. And I basically said that's not really their job. What their job is to work with the president on prosecuting his agenda. Certainly loyal people will tell the president straight up to his face what they like about what he's doing and what they don't like. And what the president really needed at that time, John, was people around him that weren't going to alter their behavior in his presence and become sycophants. And so what I don't like about these cowards is they write these anonymous letters about the president. They say all this nonsense, but they don't stand up and actually speak their mind directly or in a forward direction. And so what I said was, there's a ton of backstabbing here in Washington. I'm more of a front stabber. I'll tell you exactly how I feel right to your face. And so I don't think it's fair to the president that these people they had the opportunity and the privilege to work inside the White House, but then they were conspiring against them. And so I think something's amiss there. And it's also caused a problem for the president now because it's hard to figure out which people are really on his team and which people are acting as internal obstructionists. So I think it's a hard thing for him, frankly. And I think it's unfair.
Why is Trump's White House, like the Trump Organization for decades, such a dysfunctional hotbed of infighting? And ultimately, does the president have to take responsibility for it?
Well, he has to take responsibility because one of the hiring decisions that he made was to hire Reince Priebus. And so once he put Priebus in place, it was like hiring the creature from the Black Lagoon to drain the swamp. And so when you're the creature from the Black Lagoon, you're not going to drain the swamp. What he did was he flooded the administration with Washington operatives and former Washington lobbyists and anybody that was loyal to the RNC. And he did everything he possibly could to eliminate all of the Trump loyalists. And so, you know, I shouldn't have taken it as personally, but he did the same thing to me that he did to Rudy Giuliani or Governor Chris Christie or anybody for that matter that was from New York that had a pre-existing relationship with the president. So yes, the president bears responsibility because a few of his critical primary hiring decisions, he actually put people in place that didn't necessarily like him, and they were trying to figure out a way to forward and further the establishment's agenda as opposed to the president's more, what I would say, an agenda that was going to sort of break up Washington a little bit or act as a as a an incentive to improve Washington on behalf of the American people. And so, the guys that wanted the status quo, they formed an alliance with Priebus, and that's what really hurt the president early on.
2 years now into his term, and Donald Trump remains historically unpopular, the only president not to reach 50% in approval in the Gallup poll. What do you think his chances are of winning in 2020?
We can't sit here today, even though the president's approval ratings are low, and we can't project those 18 or 20 months from now. A lot can happen between now and then. And of course, if you were with us in the campaign in the months of September and October, it looked like we were losing. But by November the 8th of 2016, we won the election. So very hard to call it right at this moment. But the one thing I would suggest to the president, not that he would listen to me, is just dial back some of the nonsense on Twitter, dial back some of the personal invective, and let's focus on things that are a little bit more moderate and a little bit more at the intersection where the moderate Republicans and the more conservative independents live. And that's how you get your approval rating up, and that will be your path to re-election. He's done a great job in the economy. He's done a great job deregulating the U.S. engine of growth, and he's also put some fantastic judges in place, including the 2 at the Supreme Court, but also 96 other federal judges. So there's a lot he can run on, but there's a lot of things going on, personality-wise, that are acting like a millstone on his approval rating. So hopefully he can adapt and pivot and dial some of that stuff back.
Anthony Scaramucci, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We've heard all about the incredible diversity of the new Congress after the 2018 midterms. There were black people, women, a guy with an eye patch, all the major groups, but they're not the only kinds of diversity. The New York Times this week looked into the backgrounds of everyone in Congress. Complicated. And they found that 70% of Congress used to be either lawyers or business people or doctors. 70% of them went to graduate school, compared to 10% of over 25s in general, and 80% of them once held previous political office. That is not what I would call diverse. And you know what even more of them have in common? Money! The 2018 midterms saw a record $5.2 billion being spent. And if we look at every 2018 seat that was flipped from one party to the other, you can see it in action. Only 3 of those seat flippers were Republicans, and 2 of them actually spent less than their opponents. But those are very much the exceptions. As we scroll down, the amount spent by Democrats to flip seats here gets very large, and they usually have to spend more than their opponents, sometimes over $8 million just to flip a House seat, and that is not just a Democrat thing. Over the last 20 years, about 80% of Senate contests and about 90% of House contests are won by the candidate who spends the most money. And this last election was pretty much the same thing. Now, that is an area that we could do with a little more diversity in.
Well, it's great to be back here on Planet America, but that is it for this week.
Indeed, plenty more on our Facebook page as always.
More of the Mooch, more of the Mooch is there.
Yes, it's true. But before we go, there is a lot of presidential talk about Beto O'Rourke, but maybe not after this. Really? It's the most sordid video since the Access Hollywood tape. It is Beto's old rock band, The Sheeps, and it will leave you begging for the Silence of the Lambs.
Bye-bye.
Time for you and me.